Thanks very much, Tim, for that introduction. Hi, I'm Benji. As Tim mentioned, I'm the Research and Communications Officer at Water Witness International, and I'll be introducing the findings of our 3-year global evidence review into accountability and advocacy mechanisms in the water sector, trying to find out what works, where and why when it comes to water accountability. And this webinar series, we've got 5 different webinars on different priority themes that we've identified, and it leans on the global evidence review, which is narrowed down to 151 high quality papers we've identified, trying to look at different case studies around the world, different qualitative and quantitative research, which is examining different aspects of accountable water governance. Today's session is on government responsiveness, and it follows on from previous sessions on gender and the role of donors. We've got 2 more sessions coming up in the coming weeks, so please do keep an eye out for them. And the basis for this presentation is our recently launched report, which was part 3 of the evidence review on these 5 priority themes. You can access that from the Accountability for Water website. And what I'll be trying to do today is just give you a flavor of some of the findings. We don't have time to go into everything in detail, but I would encourage you to have a look at the full reference list and all of the evidence which is available from our Knowledge Hub on our website. What we try to do in each chapter is organize evidence around 3 clusters. First of all, community dynamics, which influence accountability, which can subdue or stimulate government responsiveness. Secondly, the enabling environment, which informs how governments behave and respond to citizens. And thirdly, the governance dynamics, which influence the decision-making processes and ultimately the water outcomes, whether that's around action on pollution or improving access to water and sanitation services. And what we have tried to do through reviewing and analysing this evidence is develop a theory of change, which tries to kind of conceptualise some of the processes which are happening when accountability is realised, essentially. And the evidence that we have assembled is, we aim to summarize it in a way which is meaningful and useful for policymakers, practitioners, researchers, and communities as well, who are struggling to get the clean water services that they deserve. And what we've also tried to do is identify key knowledge gaps to inform future research priorities. And another part of our program is a professional research fellowship program, where some of these neglected or overlooked areas are being investigated by researchers in focus countries such as Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania. And in future webinars, we'll try to bring in some of those voices as well, so you can hear from the research that's being undertaken at the moment. So very briefly, I just want to introduce this accountability cycle we developed as part of this conceptual framework. And we investigated a range of different mechanisms, from social accountability mechanisms, including citizen report cards, and to, for example, budgetary accountability mechanisms, so participatory budget tracking, to statutory accountability mechanisms like public complaint and grievance mechanisms or public interest litigation. And also we investigated evidence-based advocacy, things like media campaigns or Freedom of Information Acts. And as you can see, for accountability to be realized, what we have dubbed the 5 R's in this diagram is what we feel is like the process which needs to occur for that process to happen. Clear rules and norms and standards, well-defined responsibilities and obligations, effective monitoring and reporting mechanisms, clear review and explanation for performance, and ultimately corrective measures and sanctions which react to any problems which have been identified within the governance process. So this is really about trying to understand what is happening in terms of this relationship between rights holding citizens and government duty bearers. Next slide, please. And just to give you a flavor of the report, what we try to do in each chapter is organize evidence around this evidence dashboard, which gives a visual breakdown of the types of evidence we were looking at. So for government responsiveness, you can see most of the evidence we looked at came from journal articles and to a lesser extent, organizational reports from NGOs and such like. A lot of the interventions that were investigated focused on strengthening citizen voice. There was also quite a lot of interest in research and analysis and debate and dialogue processes. We can also see that there was actually quite a broad geographical scope of evidence in comparison to some of the other themes identified. So we had a broad cross-section of evidence spread across Latin America, North America, Africa, and Asia. Less evidence in Europe in this instance, but yeah, you can see there's a lot of evidence in particular clustered on Kenya and East Africa, and also the United States for this one. And again, you can see in the sectors covered that there was a bit more of an even spread between evidence focusing on water resource management as well as water and sanitation services. Next slide, please. Thanks. So just to give you some of the headline findings, I'm going to start off with these community dynamics that we were looking at. And the first point that I'd like to mention is that, yeah, we found water advocacy was most effective when there were kind of accountability champions within civil society or within government who were working to build networked and socially diverse political coalitions. And these coalitions were ultimately effective in amplifying marginalized or neglected interests. So, for example, there was an example from India, in Eastern India, where a paper by Sahu presented compelling evidence to demonstrate how cross-class coalitions enhanced the credibility of low-income citizens' claims in the eyes of politicians. And their advocacy resulted in the extension of municipal wash services to informal settlements that had previously been denied such services. There was another example from Nicaragua, where Romano showed how an alliance between rural water committees, urban NGOs, and allies in local government successfully elevated water policy to become a wedge issue in national elections, and this influenced the new government's water policies to prioritize affordability, public ownership, and universal access. There was another example from Arizona's Verde River watershed, where community groups and NGOs came together to resist a planned pipeline that would divert groundwater to more affluent regions. And this coalition employed a combination of public interest litigation, media campaigns, and dialogue processes to successfully shift public opinion, which ultimately forced the federal government to act, reassessing how groundwater was managed and regulated. Another important finding was that there was a need for dedicated spaces where communities could exchange knowledge and increase their own awareness around citizen entitlements to hold authorities to account, which in turn strengthened the relationship between rights holders and government duty bearers. So, for example, there was, again, another paper from Ban et al., which focused on village sanitation in South India, and that showed how sharing information about the delegation of responsibilities in local government was a necessary precondition for the uptake of accountability mechanisms by citizens. And there's various other papers you can also have a look at in the full report. In terms of the enabling environment, this might be unsurprising, but it's important to emphasize that media was really very significant in shifting government response and the behavior of public officials. So a lot of literature highlighted the importance of sustained media coverage to increase political will to act on water and sanitation issues. And accountability mechanisms could be most impactful when media outlets accurately reported problems highlighted by citizens. So just to give an example from South Australia, there was a paper which investigated how local newspapers' detailed reportage on water allocation plans ultimately increased public awareness on the topic. And this media attention and scrutiny prompted greater involvement of the federal government to resolve conflicts between irrigated agriculture and commercial forestry. But conversely, the media can also play a negative role. So there was a paper from Saxony in Germany where there was severe flooding which had occurred. And what happens in this example was that poor or misleading coverage, which uncritically regurgitated the views of and claims of public officials, deflected responsibility away from state failures and actually weakened accountability. Because what happened was the narrative took hold where there was a blame and shame narrative promulgated by officials, which blames the public approval process, which was a participatory governance mechanism, as a scapegoat for the failure to effectively prepare and respond to floods. And yeah, this narrative was picked up and amplified by the media, which ultimately caused confusion and weakened responsibility. Again, in terms of the enabling environment, the importance of the broader political culture and like the openness and transparency within government was also quite important in terms of both trusted institutions and this strengthening of this relationship between rights holders and duty bearers. And again, this related to the importance of robust legal protections for citizens, and where mechanisms such as public interest litigation could constrain the powers of government if it was conflicting with citizen needs. And another example here from Australia, in the Murray-Darling River Basin, political will increased in response to evidence-based advocacy when there were persistent escalating demands from citizens, which drew attention to the visibly deteriorating conditions of river basin ecosystems. Next slide, please. So in terms of governance dynamics, unsurprisingly for presentation and focusing on government responsiveness, there was a lot here to try and digest. But first and foremost, I think was this finding about the need for appropriate strategies within accountability interventions, which well targeted to shifting bureaucratic attitudes and behaviours, which can then ultimately improve wash service provision. And this was very much influenced by scale, with national and local governments responding to different accountability mechanisms and incentives. So, for example, there was a paper by Hong focusing on South Korea, and it found that while at the municipal level and local government elections were quite important in terms of accountability, because there was a much closer relationship between citizens and elected officials, and they were much more responsive to these election cycles. At the national level, where there were less frequent elections, central government was less responsive, and so that in this case, internal performance monitoring was more significant when it came to accountability in terms of the fulfilling duties and carrying out functions within central government to improve water and sanitation. Another point which was raised was around decentralization, which has been a big trend in the last couple of decades across the world. Obviously, this is not a uniform trend, and it's important to understand the specificities in different circumstances. But yeah, the trend towards decentralization has been observable in water governance in particular. And what's been found in the evidence is that this could bring risks and opportunities. So it could help to maximize space for policy learning. And there was a multi-country study we looked at on river basin management. And this was looking at river basins across East Africa, Central Europe, and Central Asia. And across all of these regions, it found how decentralization had enabled a much more open and flexible, what the authors called polycentric approach, which did maximize space for policy learning and a much greater responsiveness on behalf of water authorities. But in contrast, there were other examples where it shows that rather than creating greater sensitivity and more adaptation to local circumstance, decentralization could dilute accountability by facilitating elite capture at a local level where there was less scrutiny and transparency, and it would allow local elites to control resources to the detriment of everyday citizens. Another point which is important to recognize is how clear roles and responsibilities are very important in both eliminating overlapping functions between different government departments and also addressing institutional ambiguity, which allowed certain public officials to neglect their duties or deflect responsibilities towards others. And it was important in this example that there were regular open channels for communication, both within government and also between communities and service providers. And there was evidence from both Ghana and Nigeria where the denial of urban water services to poor urban residents resulted in a hybrid model of governance where there was informal modes of water provision, which came to dominate because of the neglect from public authorities. And going back to the previous point around decentralization, this was also resulting in a consolidation of power amongst local elites, which allowed ongoing neglect on behalf of public officials. So I'm now going to move on to the final area I want to discuss, which is around emerging research priorities based on knowledge gaps in the evidence. I've talked a bit about rights holders and duty bearers, but there's a need for a much more detailed understanding of how accountability mechanisms can shift the behavior of different political constituencies and also motivate politicians to champion water policy reforms, becoming real advocates for accountability within government. There's also a need for some strategic advocacy and understanding what works in particular contexts, especially where there's conditions of much more authoritarian or restrictive governance, where civil society is less able to operate and there's closing civic space. And government responsiveness is clearly much less amenable or responsive to accountability in these regions. And again, political decentralization is something that I mentioned, but there are quite a lot of gaps in terms of how it applies in different political settings, how it interacts with different statutory accountability mechanisms. I mentioned at the beginning or earlier in the presentation the importance of scale and how that really impacted the efficacy of different tools to promote accountability. And yeah, again, how decentralization shapes the opportunity structure for accountability champions and water justice advocates to try to realize their rights. So I'm going to leave that there. Obviously, there's a lot more detail in the full report that you can read, but now I'm going to hand over